Good evening, everyone. This is the question and answer portion of session 8. My name is Eric Marks, and I am the MC for this stream. I wanted to say thank you for all our speakers and for presenting, and I want to be asking you, the viewers, questions from our Discord server and our YouTube channel. I have a little list going, but more will probably should pop up as we continue. So starting off, our first question is for the Crannog Centre. Do you find that you get more local visitors or more visitors from elsewhere, mainly from Scotland, the UK, or elsewhere?
Great, thank you. I'll just say that I'm also here with Jason, who is doing the textile project with me. If anybody, just so that you know that. Yeah, thanks, Eric. Thanks for that question. I suppose the short answer is that we're roughly sort of 50-50 split between locals and people from elsewhere. But it's quite interesting, really, that in, if you like, a pre-COVID environment, we were definitely reliant on that very large proportion of visitors who came from overseas. We used to have large coach parties coming up, especially with one particular US tour group. And it's a good income stream when you get a coach party, because instantly you've got, 40 or 45 people, or even if the coach has only got 28 on, but basically you've got all of those people coming through your doors at the same time. So from an income point of view, that was a very important thing for us. Interestingly, now that we have been going through COVID last year, and we're now trying to sort of think about a post-COVID environment for the museum, we're definitely looking towards sort of future-proofing ourselves against a reliance on the overseas visitors. We were beginning to do that anyway before the lockdown, and we've definitely begun to connect more with our local residents than we had perhaps in the past. Before, about sort of 5 or 10 years ago, there wasn't much connection to local people, but certainly in the past 4 years we've begun to sustainably do that and invest in developing very sort of longer term links with our local communities. And in a way, our mantra is, which is something that Aidan had touched on in his presentation, our mantra, if you like, is something like, only by connecting to the communities of today can we connect to the Crannog community of 2,500 years ago. So what we've done in the past couple of years to connect more to local residents is we've managed to, well, we've certainly increased our volunteer hours. We used to have just a few a year, in recent years, but last year, sorry, 2019, we're not really recording 2020 figures. But in 2019, we recorded 4,000 hours of volunteer hours, which was absolutely fantastic. And obviously those people are largely going to be from our local catchment area. We've also increased our open season. We used to only open from April to October, but now we open from February to December. And we really only close in January for maintenance, which isn't much fun in the middle of all the snow, but that's how it is. We also do things like free events for local people. So, for example, our Celtic Yule event is always free. And again, because that's held in the winter, the chances are that that's more local people who will come to that than tourists. And we've also got various schemes like our apprenticeship scheme, which recruits local school leavers from the area to come and work with us for a year, and things like that. And we're definitely going to increase that, sort of keep that trajectory going when it comes to local residents. We think that a post-COVID environment is going to completely rewrite the way in which museums work, and our reliance on regular old income streams, such as the visiting tourists and coach parties and things. We're going to totally rewrite and revise how we have to find our money coming in. So I hope that gives some sort of an answer to the questioner.
It does, and that kind of leads into the second question. How connected do the locals residents feel about the centre?
Yes, well, on the strength of all those on those things that I've just mentioned there, the proof's in the pudding, really, with our recording of data such as volunteer hours and so forth, and the fact that we've started to get these local schemes up. We are definitely seeing much more of a connectedness to people, and much more of an awareness. We're just about to do a big development project on the other side of the loch, and we got a community asset transfer scheme to get a bit of Forestry Land Scotland land to do that, and we would not have got that community asset transfer if we hadn't been able to demonstrate that there was very strong local support for what we want to do, and that was evidenced through lots of sort of data gathering over the past 2 or 3 years, but also sort of qualitative as well as quantitative data, and recording it in different ways, people's experiences with us, as well as just facts and figures about their own sort of demographic data and so forth. And all of that data went into a huge bulk of supporting information for our CAT application. So I think that the proof's in the pudding there into how connected we are with our local people, because we wouldn't have got that scheme if we hadn't been able to prove that we did have their support.
Great. All right, I have a question for Carolyn. How does one go about finding colored earths for paint?
Thank you. That's pretty much the main question people have usually about how to make their own pigments. Genuinely, the answer is that you have to forage for colors, and that's a whole range of different skills, but it can be very, very easy and very natural as well. Personally, for example, when I started, I used to go on the seaside, so just go to the beach. And I was lucky enough to be at the time, and not so long ago, in the south of England, where some of the beaches are actually completely covered in colors when you want to see them, if it makes sense. But genuinely, if you walk around wherever you go, in the countryside, for example, if you go on a walk through woodlands, ideally, even in your garden, you might find some clays, and I prefer starting with clays because they dry very easily. They are very pleasant to use, and to grind, they're quite easy, really. You can also find colored sands, but genuinely look for the side of fields, of roads. Of course, be careful if there are some chemicals sprayed on the fields, for example. But if you find some colored clay, and the color can be just a different brown still a color, you can use them to make your own pigments. After that, there are some people who forage colors in cities as well. I'm not used to that myself because I live in very rural areas, but you can find that as well. Personally, what I prefer to tell people who want to start is an interesting piece of brick, brick or tiles, or even broken unglazed pottery and sort of things, because it will always be clay that is cooked, but it's a clay. You can grind it as hard as it is, and if you find on the side of a field a very old brick, for example, there might be an incredibly bright red color compared to modern very orangey ones. But that again, you can just grind in a pestle and mortar, and use water to levigate it, to separate the particles, and make pigment out of it.
Cool. I live in the southeastern United States, and we have a lot of iron in our soil. So our clays are really bright red, and they stain our clothes very bad. Yeah. So, but that's what I used too back when I was using like dirt paint and clay paint. So that's really cool. All right, I have a question for Margaret. It says, first off, I'm glad to see an experienced engineer getting involved in experimental archaeology. We have a couple in dark, and it really makes a difference to have practical understanding of material and stresses. I was curious about the hurdles as a ramp. Your demonstration has no side supports, and I was wondering about the amount of deformation.
One of the interesting things is that in the images that appear in this book, it seems that they used ladders much more like ramps to begin with, before they made them much more vertical, if I can use that in an explanation. So what I was amazed at is when I actually put that ramp, when I put the hurdle down, it hardly bent at all. I was expecting it to almost touch the ground, and it didn't, with no side supports. But in one of the images, what it shows, if you look very closely, is there's almost like two vertical poles, and then the hurdle is fixed somehow to those vertical poles, and then the people are then walking on top of the hurdle. So it's a whole area that I don't think anybody's looked at that I'm aware of.
Okay. There is also a second part. Is there any hint in the illustrations about what distances they were spanning without support, or how much you saw in experiments of the amount of bend in the hurdles before the slope became too unclimbable?
Well, my experiment was concentrating mainly on using them as a scaffold board rather than a ramp, because I wanted to sort of narrow it down a bit. And one of the issues when testing was that there was a lot of spring in them. They were quite bendy, but they weren't actually flimsy. The amount of load that they could hold was quite considerable, really. So it's an area that really needs further testing. So that's why I'd like to look at them as a fabric material rather than a sheet material.
Okay, gotcha.
But I would say that they span equally as well as sort of modern scaffold boards would. They provide the same sort of working area. Okay, so roughly 6 feet or 2 meters or so? Yeah, it's more the shortest width of about 3-4 foot, or what's the just over a meter, and then whatever length you require, really. Okay, interesting. All right, the next question is for Aidan and all. What is the ratio of male to female depictions in the figurines?
Great question. We don't really know, because to make a decision would require a phallocentric interpretation, as it were. The figures generally don't have a depiction of genitalia, which would be the way, obviously, that we would decide upon the biological sex of a figure. Most of the ones that I was talking about there, the Kilbeg figures, there's nothing to say. If anything, there's certainly, there's no prominent phalluses on any of them. And to illustrate the point, there is a figure from Ralaghan, County Cavan, which is early to middle Bronze Age. And it has typically been interpreted as a male figure because there's a hole down at the waist level, or below the waist level, which people have interpreted as holding maybe a stone phallus. But as far as I understand, that phallus never survived, and what you have there is a hole, which of course could be a vagina. So no specific answer on that one, vague in the details on that one, and even when we do have the evidence, it's interesting that people would reach for the kind of the male warrior figure rather than necessarily the female figure. But it's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Okay, and a follow-up, there's a making of the replica figurines. Did you approach it from a purely technical perspective, a groove this big here, etc., or did you also allow artistic interpretation?
That question is bang on to actually what happened. So it was a collection of archaeologists and artists, and when we gathered as a group on a cold day in December in 2016 with our bronze axes and with our alder wood, we basically discussed it, and everybody said they would go for whatever it is they wanted to do. So the artists and some of the archaeologists went for a more expressive, interpretive approach, which is to make the figure that they wanted to make, or whatever figure they felt was coming out of the wood. Some of the wood had kind of branches on it and so on. But Michael Stanley, who's the archaeologist who excavated the Kilbeg figure in the bog, he very determinedly went to make the Kilbeg figure as he remembered it, because he had that personal connection. And down the years since, the ones that we have found more interesting are the ones which most evoked the original Bronze Age figures rather than the other ones. And we erected them just inside the gate of CMAC, and they have been watched by the general public and passers-by for years, and have always provoked questions. People have always asked us, well, what are they? What are they? And we would tend to say, well, we don't really know. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. All right. Next question is for Martha. You mentioned how a lack of skill might have impacted some of your experiments. How are you planning to account for this in the future experiments?
Yeah, so great question. Thank you. So first of all, if I get the opportunity to do any more work on this research topic, which I would love, I would like to do more of what I'm doing at the moment, which is talking to people and presenting and getting other people's perspectives. I'd like to get some more formal training from more experienced people, but I'd also like to just repeat what I'd done. Obviously, there was a huge amount of limitation, which I explained in the presentation, due to COVID, which not only hindered the resources, but also hindered my ability to be around peers and to share knowledge and experience and learn from that. It was very much quite an isolated situation. So I would definitely like to repeat my experiments, increase the amount of repetition so that I can not only learn through doing, but also record it and use that data. So I think that's mainly it. It is a mixture of learning from others and learning by doing, and improving upon what I've already done by better recording methods, more time, and better resources. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And the second question is to you also. Do you know why the raw material for the points was suggested by David et al. To be either human, wild boar, or brown bear? And has it been considered to do zoo MS analysis?
Yeah, brilliant. This is one of the really big questions about the collection. I mean, there's so many. I mean, this collection obviously is, the work was started on it and then unfortunately was stopped. And there is so much to do, which is incredibly exciting, but also quite overwhelming as well. And one of those things is about species. There's probably two main reasons why David et al. Believed those three were the most likely. The first is because, as I think I mentioned, Ireland has a very different mammalian fauna kind of portfolio, I guess, to the rest of Europe. There weren't any ungulates, there was no deer, no cattle. Deer didn't come in. I don't actually know what point deer came in. Oh, sorry, during the Neolithic, deer came in, and cattle wasn't until the very end of the Mesolithic and the beginning of the Neolithic. So at the point in time that these artifacts were produced, there was just those animals didn't exist in Ireland. So the only ones that were present that we know of at the moment were brown bear, which has clearly been recorded previously, humans ourselves, and wild boar. Obviously, there's much smaller mammalian fauna, but those aren't viable for, or unlikely to be viable for the use of producing bone points that we're seeing in terms of size in the collection. I think there's a possibility and some debate as to whether there were wolves in Ireland at that time. That's something I'm not completely sure about. So whether that would be an option. The other reason for those three is because I think in the collection and also in Lowhan Island, which is 1 kilometre away with a much smaller collection, have had an identified human ulnar bone modified into a bone point. So there is at least one confirmed human bone point, possibly two. So that again influences the quite unusual idea of having human remains as tools. Zoom mass spectrometry was noted as something that they wanted to do in the programme going forward. But again, unfortunately, due to Peter Woodman's passing and the hiatus in the project, that's something that hasn't been done. That's something, again, if I had the opportunity in the future, I would really like to do, because I think this topic is not only important for understanding this assemblage, but may be able to tie Ireland into other trends that we're seeing, such as the use of human bone in bone points in the Netherlands in relationship to Doggerland.
Thank you so much. Alice, are you ready? There's one question for you. You mentioned that some primates suck out the silica from stones. Do you know if there is any evidence for this in tools used by early humans?
Hi, thank you for the question. This is a very interesting question. What we see is that there are some pounding and cracking stone tools even in the early Olduvaian phases. So if those, and there have been some user studies where they were comparing stone used for cracking nuts with the stones from Olduvaian sites, and they have seen that they have comparable userware, but we are not completely sure then how those tools they were used, and especially like if we refer to silica and Silica, that's different questions, because for example silica can be dangerous to human being, especially inhale silica. So we see comparable pounding tools between chimpanzee, for example, or primate use and early phases of Olduvaian. But we don't think that the early humans were eating eating silica out of rocks.
Okay, very interesting. We have a second kind of question for you too. It says, very interesting investigation. If we look at modern humans, can we see any obvious skeletal differences between hunter-gatherer and modern man? Like the overbite having come in after grain entered our diet?
Oh, yeah, that is a very interesting question, and it's very broad. What we seen, that was a bit out of the topic of the presentation, but what we seen actually is then there are differences in the morphological and skeleton between Neanderthals, so Neanderthal species, and modern human species or Homo sapiens. The reason of those differences, of course, goes they can be related to diet components, but as Neanderthals, they were still hunter-gatherers. What we think is then the difference, especially in the thumb morphology, were more related to the functionality and therefore to the dexterity implementation of the human hands. But of course, there are some interference with diets, because different diets that they can, for example, cause some pathologies on the osteology of the human hands. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you. Okay, Phoebe, I have a couple of questions for you. You said that the birch tar combined with ash was the strongest. How did you investigate this? Saw a machine. How did you define a strong glue?
Thank you for the question. I actually wasn't expecting any questions, so that's yeah, thank you. So what I was doing, this was kind of the exploratory phase of my research, was I looked at a range of different, I guess, recipes of birch tar, so with different additives. So I tried one with beeswax, one with rosin in, one with holly ash, and I've tried a couple of combinations between rosin and ash and beeswax and rosin. And then the way that I tested them, so I left them to dry for a couple of days between two pieces of leather. And the way that I tested them was by putting one side of the leather in a clamp, and then the other piece of leather that had been glued together with it had a grommet in it. And I hooked that to a machine that measures force, but I think it was just in kilograms rather than newtons. And I used a lever to pull that backwards, and I measured how many kilograms it took to pull apart that bond. And at that point, my only way of seeing which one was stronger really was a comparison to itself, as in between the just birch bark tar with the other recipes, which the holly ash was getting kind of 6 kilograms of weight, whereas the birch bark tar alone was only getting 0.35 kilograms of weight. So there was quite a big difference. And I hope that answers it.
It does. Okay, part 2 was that you left us hanging. What were the results of your further experiments?
I left you hanging because I literally have finished pulling them apart today, this afternoon. So I have not done any analysis yet because this is kind of my dissertation research. I'm a little bit behind because of COVID, but at the moment, the ones that I did 20% inclusion of ash, so 80% tar, 20% ash, seems to be kind of the most consistent one. So I tried mixtures at 10%, 20%, 30, 40, and then a few at 50 and a few at 60. And whilst the 30 and 40% still had ones that were quite high, so kind of I did get a couple that were 16 kilograms, which was way more weight than I expected. They tend to, once you hit about 30%, it seems like, I haven't done any analysis yet, so I could be a bit wrong, but it seems that they start to become quite random. So the 40% one, I had one of my strongest ones, I think. It was about 15 kilograms. But then I also had one that fell apart with only 2 kilograms of weight. So it seems that if I was making it, I would stick to the lower, to the 20%, because it seems more consistent. I hope that answers it.
That did. Thank you so much. Okay, let's go back to Lawrence Null. The first question is, in the videos, you sometimes use 2 hands and sometimes use 1 hand when using the tool. Was it a personal preference, or did you see one that was more efficient or comfortable?
So Nora is our useware specialist in the project, and Chris is the person you saw in the video who was basically using the hafted corex for digging. And I took over from him, and I was using 2 hands because of the arrangement of the corex angle in relation to the handle. The second video you saw was Chris using a smaller handle, and he was holding it in 1 hand and he was working wood. And if you can unmute Chris, he could probably explain why he went one-handed with that. And we were both using 2 hands for the digging.
Yes, I'll try and speak to that. Thank you, Larry. It really was just kind of personal preference and to do with control. So it was a small piece of wood I was chopping. I have done further experiments, and we have research in the department, which I can't say too much about, a PhD which has just been completed, which speaks to the kind of ergonomics of using 2 hands and hafting, and the amount of force that you can apply. So in this case, it was personal preference, but one of the benefits of the handle was that you can apply significantly more body force using 2 hands when you need to. I hope that answers the question.
Just to add to that, when we were both in that deep pit there facing the sands, which were the 500,000-year-old sands, it was a vertical trench, and the 2 hands were just basically the way of engaging and getting into that sediment and pulling it down. It's basically as simple as that.
Okay. For part 2, it says, how did the locals use similar tools in this way?
Well, in terms of digging earth, we didn't observe that. That doesn't seem to be a tradition using something like an axe or an adze. They use a hoe. So these are farming societies, and they are breaking the earth with a different hafting arrangement. But in terms of woodworking, the adze is a very, very effective tool, as I said in the video, but also one that's very widely used across this woodland area for shaping wood. It's also used not just for woodworking. It's used in a variety of practical ways, like, for example, scraping a skin. It can be used for digging. It's one of those kind of basic tools, like a screwdriver today, you can use for purposes that it wasn't really designed for. Like you use a screwdriver to pop open a lid on a paint tin or can. That wasn't designed for that, but yeah, it works that way. The adze is one of these multi-purpose tools. The other tool is the axe that people use in the communities. So there's a hoe, the axe, and the adze, and those 3 things basically allow them to farm and extract what they need from the woodlands. And why make more tools when those things do what you need?
That's true. That's true. Okay, part 3 of that is, it's great to see an archaeologist connecting with the local people in a meaningful way. The wood chopping video reminded me in Papua New Guinea. I saw a person chop open a tree trunk with just a few chops of a machete. There was a lot of handling skill, not only good materials. Could the resin hafting maybe work if the tool were handled in a certain way?
I'm not sure if that's a question about the arrangement of the haft and the corex that was in the video made by John Cañata. But if it was, I still don't think it would work, and Chris could talk about this as well, because the asymmetry of that stone and the weight of that stone wouldn't work in that particular handle. The handle would need to be changed. Perhaps if you change the handle and added more resin to it, it might have worked. But we didn't want to impose our expectations on him. We wanted his knowledge of the materials and how he understood the shape of the object, the weight of the object, and he knew what we wanted to do with it. So working wood, so hard contact. But because it was out of his experience, you look at the iron edge and the axe and in the adze, they're very thin, they're very lightweight by comparison. So I think if we had worked with him over time, and maybe this is something we could go back to him and others who have the indigenous knowledge and say, right, become familiar with these things and let's see what you do with them. That could actually produce some really interesting results, because you have the knowledge of the woods and the adhesives. And once they got the understanding of the properties of the stone, then you might have something really effective, which would be particularly useful for understanding the deep pasts that we were looking at.
Good, thank you so much. All right, heading back to the top of Crannog Centre. Fran, do you also get inspiration from new experiments, other ideas from your visitors and volunteers?
Yes, is the short answer to that. Definitely, because everything we do is in the public domain, then there's no doubt that the visitors watching, as Jason said in the video, they see the failures as well as the successes, and that nothing is hidden with what we do with regarding to that. But I'll hand over to Jason, who can answer that a little bit more fully, because he's definitely the one at the coalface when it comes to that.
Hi there. I just think the fact that all the experiential work we do here is live anyway. So it could be something that spins off research into a completely new direction. For example, we have a dye that's failed systematically, and then we might have a chemist who's coming around on a tour that suddenly points out why and what we need to add to the dye to make it to work. And all of a sudden it's kind of spinning off in a completely different direction. So I think, our whole approach really is we're kind of constantly making ourselves vulnerable, and we're holding ourselves up to critique. So when the visitors come around, they are welcome to join in. So it's not that we are showing things to people, but we're actually inviting people to take part as they come around the centre. And sometimes you'll get people that will be sitting for an hour or two. And again, that might send us off in a whole new direction about basket making, or making thread, or making cord, or whatever it is. So we're really, really open to that. And I think that's one of the ways that the museum actually develops in the way that it has done.
Great. How are you going to source the wool in your recreation attempts? Even heritage breeds are likely to be extinct matches for ancient fibers.
Certainly part of the testing that we're going to do is going to try and identify the sort of closest living sort of a sheep breed to the descendant, if you like, of the animal that would have given us the sheep. But again, regarding the sourcing of that, that's part of the textile project. And again, Jason can say a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as we find out what breed of sheep it is, we'll match it as closely as possible. Up until that point, we'll probably use something like Soe, something like that. A very, very long staple, very, very easy to spin. And it's probably the closest to our prehistoric ancestors, kind of the sheep that they were using. I think just in terms of sourcing the fleece, this links really back to the question we were talking about earlier on about how do we connect to our local community. And, we're connected with local farmers, and every spring they bring all the fleeces down. They can't get rid of them, they can't sell them. So all the fleeces are brought down to the Crannog Centre, and then they become garments or tablet weaving. So again, and we've got people locally who have got primitive breed sheep as well. So that's what we'll be doing. So hopefully this year again, it will be Soe sheep.
Okay. Okay, Carolyn, I have a couple questions for you. Were you an experienced artist before you did have a lot of experience with this type of material or technology? And how steep was the learning process?
Oh, thank you for the question. I'm still not an artist. No, I have never been. That's the interest I have, is that I like painting buildings. And the examples I produced for the conference are actually some of my most finest work, shall we say. Otherwise, it might be one or two colors. So that's what I quite like, actually, experimenting without the background of modern artistic knowledge. So I feel like I both lose from not knowing what kind of softness of paintbrushes I would use for such and such paint, or how binders all work, especially modern ones. But on the other hand, I've never heard about a mower, for example, before I started looking at pigments. And I never used to mold my pigment, to grind them with a sort of glass, for whoever doesn't know, a glass, very smooth pebble, shall we say, that makes an extremely fine paint.
Okay, let's see.
People would use something like that. So the learning curve is incredibly steep. I learn every time I meet somebody who knows art in itself, who knows geology, or who forages or walks quite a lot. It's always very, very interesting. So hopefully, to answer the question, is I'm not an artist. I don't think you need to be an artist to start making pigments. And I'm hoping I will get a better understanding of all these possibilities and solutions. But later on, when I know more about the actual archaeology and evidence that are around, and maybe cross both one day.
All right. Okay, here's another one for you. It says, have you ever explored botanical pigments or found any evidence or indication of their use, i.e. pigments from plants as distinct from dye?
Yes, and to have met Jason at the Scottish Crannog Centre, I can confirm that there is a world of colors really lying into the plants, the organic pigments, so the dyes. Yes, I've done a tiny little bit of natural dyeing for Iron Age colors, because one has to at some point. The difference there is that, as said in the talk, you have organic and inorganic pigments. So the organic one, the plants, the dyes pigments, are very different and work on a completely different base than the mineral, the inorganic, the stones and earths ones. You can turn a dye, so a plant material, into a mineral pigment by a technique we call laking. So if you make a lake, you are dyeing a white material, for example, chalk. If you grind it, you can get a dye to adhere to it, and to get, in the end, when it's dried, a colored pigment, a colored mineral. So that exists, and that's existed in antiquity. I don't know at all when it started. I can mention mainly Madder Lake, that has been very, very popular, especially in, well, where we have texts, so the Greco-Roman world. I think they are used mainly on the Tanagra figurines, the very, very fine sculptures that are, you have to look it up, Tanagra. But they are used on clay figurines, and also as basis for makeup, for cosmetics. And some other ones, some other lakes are mentioned as pigments by Vitruvius, the Roman author, who wrote the architecture about pigments, lime, buildings, fashions, and all that sort of things. So lakes from plants turned into a mineral pigments definitely existed. I have been asked about woad, especially in Iron Age and British Iron Age, Pictish contexts. You can lake woad. It was more popular to lake indigo, to make an indigo paint and indigo pigment in Roman times and in Roman texts. Though you can make it, but as far as I know of other people doing experiments, you get a very light Air Force type of blue that can look slightly on the grey side of things as well. So there you will have the difference between what is possible to do and the actual archaeological or textual or historical or ethnographical evidence of what exists.
Oh yeah, that was great. Okay, Margaret, I have a question for you. It says, is there a minimum thickness of willow with these woven branches that you think make a hurdle usable as a standing platform above the ground? Did you experience or try out these hurdles above the ground yourself?
Yes, I did. We did it wasn't very far off the ground, just a couple of inches, but yeah, we put a hurdle suspended slightly. It felt a bit more like walking across a trampoline because there's so much give in it. It's quite springy. It's quite an experience, which is interesting. When it comes to the minimum thickness of withies, I think one of the amazing things is that as you're combining an engineering material with what is a textile, a woven textile, you get a combination of forces that make it stronger. So, I mean, to actually answer the specific question, I would say up to about 1 centimetre and above would make a good hurdle. But what you actually get is something in textiles called the crimp, which is a sort of up and down weaving, combines with as you're making a hurdle, you're actually pre-stressing, that's an engineering term, the withies. And so when you load it, these forces start cancelling each other out, which makes for a much, much stronger product in the end. And I think I think it's that's never really been looked into. I mean, as I said in my presentation, what I couldn't believe is that modern day we use hot air balloon baskets, which are woven. They are part of an aircraft, and yet nobody has done any testing on them. And you know, again, as any engineer will tell you, the thought of actually taking people up in the air in a contraption that has never been tested for its strength just seems unbelievable.
That's very true. Okay, Aidan, I have a questions for you. This is, among the storytelling side of experimental archaeology, what can you help in selecting the more interesting stories which can be told about the past, and should we?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I suppose kind of the example of this conference is, what is it, 80 papers told by hundreds of people, telling multiple stories. So I suppose my response would be a personal one to that. As an archaeologist, I see myself as a storyteller. And I'm not interested in monumental architecture or structures of power, or all that kind of thing. I actually am more interested in dwellings and daily life and the routines of making your way in the world, of raising a family, all of those kinds of things. It's what the anthropologist Clifford Geertz said, you know, what do people do? What do they think they're doing, and to what end were they doing it? So if you were to take the kind of the example of the anthropomorphic figures there, we would see them as artifacts of the past, to be gathered into a museum, to be curated, to be conserved, to be managed, all of those things. And we kind of capture them as objects in the ways that Haida and the Tlingit said shouldn't be done to the totem poles of the Pacific Northwest, that they shouldn't be in museums. They're meant to fall into the ground. They're meant to get covered in moss and rot and go back down into the ground. And they often are, when they haven't been taken often in colonial interventions. But for me, the wooden figures are about people in the past, who had intentions, who had hopes, who had fears, and they had stories that they wanted to tell. And one of the stories that they were telling is through one of these figures. So for me, experimental archaeology, it's for me personally, it seeks out the ordinary, the routines of people who don't have a place in powerful structures, who don't have a voice in history. And for example, I regard houses, ordinary houses, as a place where society is made, rather than public assembly sites or whatever. I mean, all those things are important as well. So I kind of go with the American historical archaeologist James Dietz, small things forgotten. But in the answer to the question, you know, they're the stories I'm interested in. And clearly from this conference, there are scholars all across the world. And let me repeat again, as I've been saying on Twitter and social media over the last couple of days, it's just stunning. EAC 12 is a model for how all global conferences should be carried out. And I'd say that, you know, the much better funded, more powerful organizations like EAA or SAA or you know, organizations across the world, the quality of the conference and the ability to reach that, you know, much larger number of people, and the ability to have people to be able to speak at this conference who could not otherwise do so. I think EXARC should, and all of the people involved in the organization of this conference should be delighted. And in a sense, EXARC has enabled multiple stories to be told. So should we tell these stories? People should tell the stories that they want to tell. And there's no one way of, you know, experimental archaeologists deciding which stories are the important ones and which are the ones that don't need to be told. But it's a great question, obviously, and it's one, but I think is up to every scholar to be thinking about what stories they want to tell. And for me, the kind of the work that we do at CMAC is in a sense ordinary people's lives, the skills and knowledge that they had, the things that they made, the things that they used, the ways that they lived together, rather than anything, you know, massive about monumental landscapes. But that's just me. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is for you also. It says, is there a possibility that the figurines were part of a burial ritual?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. I mean, these are all great questions, but I think that's actually what it is. So in Bronze Age and Iron Age Ireland, we have in our boglands, and this is similar patterns across Northwest Europe, obviously, we have tended to think about bog bodies as being ritual deposition in certain circumstances, maybe over influenced by kind of Roman texts and so on about what's actually going on. But we need to remember that in the past and in many societies, the boundaries between people and things and animals are quite fluid, and there isn't a straight distinction. I don't really understand post-humanism, but I think that one of the aspects of it is that we need to put ourselves back into the world. So what is actually going on in these boglands? They're certainly bringing human corpses out onto the bogs, and they often show evidence for violence. But they do other things too. They carry out and put into bog pools ordinary objects like quern stones for grinding grain, wooden vats of butter, which are going into the bog, which could be there for preservative reasons, but it could also be actually offerings in some sense. The palace boy wooden vessel, this is a large wooden trough which had a long life. It showed evidence for damage and repair and use, and maybe it was used for heating water, maybe inside an Iron Age house. But at some stage, the people who made and used it over years decided that that object was now either dying or dead. And they carried it out onto a bog, and it would be a heavy thing. They put it into a bog pool and they pinned it into position using branches, sharpened branches into the, which is exactly what happened to some Bronze Age and Iron Age bog bodies, that they were pinned into pools in water. I think what the Kilbeg figures and figures like that are what we're seeing is the very end of the story. There's an awful lot that we're never going to know, but essentially, could they be used in burial ritual? I think this is what's actually happening. I think it's a great question. I think what's actually happening is people are regarding something that we'd regard as a thing as animate, that it had a life. It may have been a short life in this example. I think our own experiments demonstrated that it probably was erected vertically in a bog for a period of time, probably in terms of months rather than years, because it certainly had been exposed but wasn't badly damaged, and its sharpened point was perfectly pristine. So it was standing in waterlogged soil, which is anaerobic, so that it's very well preserved. And then at some point, they made a decision, it's time for this to be buried, and that's what they did. So we see in that process how people in the Bronze Age and Iron Age are moving through the world, in terms of people, in terms of objects, in terms of landscapes, in terms of things, and also in terms of those key stories of birth, life and death, which are common to all our humanity, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you. Martha, in stage 1, you decided to grind the surface of the bone. Did you also consider other methods like chopping? And if so, why did you choose grinding?
So the reason why I ground the surface of the bone for regulation is actually because it was specified in the publication. So the first stage in the publication by David et al. Was the regulation of the diaphysis of the bone, so like the central part of the bone, through oblique grinding, but with the distal ends, the joints still attached, which through my experiments, I found that just really didn't work. So the only reason why that's the only method I tried was because it was specified in the proposed production sequence, which I was testing. In the future, it would be really good to look at other methods for doing this. It would be interesting to see if there would be a difference if you removed the distal ends prior to trying this, but I still have concerns about this method because the thickness of bone in profile varies. So if you're grinding an edge that looks as if it's thick on the outside, you could actually be wearing and weakening the core material itself, which is what I experienced. And also because just using a static grinding surface, which is in my case was flat, the natural curve of the bone meant you couldn't target areas. So yeah, it would be really interesting. I think it would also play a part in how the bone is initially processed, which is not something I'll get into now, but something I'm also interested in within bone and osseous studies, that we don't necessarily talk about the initial processing of bone before our experimentation. So whether having fresh, what you call green bone, dried bone, boiled bone, aged bone, how they might affect this stage and the methods that you could use to alter them.
Okay, that also goes into your second question. Due to COVID, your options and raw materials were limited. How did it affect your research?
Yeah, this was a huge problem. I think I explained we were really limited to resources. So I was only able to get my bone from one local butcher's, who were incredibly kind and gave me any bone offcuts that they had. Initially, I specified that I only wanted to be working with pig bones, because of discussions I'd had with a specialist at UCD saying that realistically that was the closest I was going to get to a wild boar. It'd be very difficult for me to get wild boar material, and then especially with COVID, absolutely. Obviously, I can't really use, especially for an MSc, I can't really use brown bear or human bone for such research. So initially, this was a big problem. It meant that the number of experiments I was able to do was limited. So I was only able to repeat each experiment 3 times, which I completely understand from a scientific rigor perspective is just not okay. And also I had been hoping that for each experiment, I would start off with a fresh, previously unexperimented piece of bone, so that I could then compare that material to the collection and isolate different macro wear to each activity, and therefore get a better collection with which to use. But again, because I didn't have enough material, I just had to use what I had. However, However, this did mean that I actually got a better understanding for how one stage of the production sequence affected the other, which I think was actually a really important point for me, understanding, for example, where the regulation of the initial regulation of the bone through grinding weakened the material, how that then affected the removal of the distal ends and the methods that I could use with which to do that. Also, I was forced in the end, due to shortages at the butchers, to use cattle bone, which obviously from a proxy perspective was not realistic for Ireland. However, again, by using this in my mind, I thought, okay, well, maybe I can look at the amount, the size of bone and what that can produce in terms of a tool and material wastage. So actually comparing the cattle bone in somewhat, I know it's not the same, to the brown bear in terms of size. And I actually found that the the cattle bone produced workable material, so that the final points that I have were all made from the cattle bone, and it was thicker, it held up better, and produced sizes of points which I could see similarities with in the collection. The pig bone, in comparison, was incredibly fine and brittle, and I think here there needs to be possible discussion about using modern domesticated animals which are killed young and which are bred for meat, to wild animals whose potentially their bones are going to develop in quite a different way. They're going to be older. So it'd be very interesting to then later, again, in further research, to look at that and see how that affects things. I know that was very long. I hope that answered the question.
No, that was great. Okay, says Alice and all, there was much variations in the gesture sequences used by your modern nappers that could have been a difference more attributed to a style, school, community of practice difference.
That is a very good question, actually. And this was a question we ask ourselves when we decide our experimental program, because we were interested on the ergonomic side of the study, but we were also asking ourselves if personal styles or tradition on flea napping different flea napping schools might have influenced our results. So what we did actually, at the beginning, let's say we planned a experimental sample, which were our flea napper participants, which came from different schools, different countries, and I think the 5 of them represented 5 different countries covering 3 different continents. In this way, we had assembled and could cover, let's say, traditional personal styles or flea napping schools. But interestingly, what we observed from our results is that there is a very limited way or very limited grips or grip types that can be used to hold on-hand specific tools. For example, there are limited grips that they can be employed for, let's say, using holding hard hammerstones. Except for the basketball grips, so the 5 fingers, thumb to fingers grips, which is the one that was the most employed across all participants, there are not many other grip styles that can be used. So this gave us an idea that actually the ergonomic strategies of the human hands around the stone tools and the tools themselves, they were really related to the ergonomics and to the shape of the tools. Yeah, well, we also ability among the different participants, which I didn't speak about that during the presentation, but we just submitted a paper, and that's part of the paper. What we have seen then, although it was some internal variability, for example, on the holding of soft hammerstone like handler billets, the internal variability was not that large. So again, the final conclusion was that is the ergonomics and the shape of the tools then will require and recruit different hand grip types. So I hope that answered the questions.
It did. Thank you so much. Okay, Phoebe, have you used any Paleolithic glues in your own clothing creations?
That's a good question. I mean, the answer is quite short. I haven't, but I would really like to do that in the future. And I also would quite like to investigate using sewing technology, so like needle and thread, as well as the tar in the same point. I think that would make a really strong seam, and I'd like to test that.
Yes, I believe so too. Now, the second question is, do you find that there is a mix recipe that you prefer using yourself? Maybe not the strongest bond, but a pleasant or easy to use mix between birch tar and wax or ash, etc.?
Oh, that's a good question. I think actually the ash, if I didn't have gloves, I think holly ash is quite caustic. So I think I probably wouldn't choose that one as my first one. And I found that the rosin took quite a long time to melt, and it was still quite, when you tore them apart, you could still see bits of rosin that hadn't melted properly. So I think probably the beeswax would be my favorite. It also had the most noticeable change. It was a very matte color, whereas the others were still quite shiny. So I think beeswax is my favorite, even though it was not the strongest at all.
We go into the Crannog Centre. Fran, have you been able to determine the staple length and crimp of the fibers in your sample? Diameter would be easier, but these other qualities must be challenging.
No, that's what the testing is going to be done. In fact, this is so timely because just last Thursday I went down to Glasgow University to take the fragment down in order to get that to get those tests done, and one of those things will be to determine the staple and also the thickness of each individual fibre. So we should have the results of that by the time of our interview for the EXARC conference. We're going to book a slot for that in August to give Dr. Susanna Harris at Glasgow Uni time to do the analysis. So if you tune into that, then you should have some answers, hopefully.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the second question is, how did you get the color purple? And what is the next type of loom that you're going to use? And how is the different warp weighted loom?
Okay, so the color purple was from a lichen called Archaeology, and you find it on east-facing granite. Again, it's another interesting process of how was this discovered? It has to be soaked in urine for a minimum of 3 months before you get any color coming out of the urine. So I think it's beautiful that you get this color. You find it in archaeology from the Iron Age in Austria. But again, this question is, how did people discover that, and what were they doing to discover that? So the second question was,
what is the next type of loom you're going to use, and how is it different to a warp weighted loom?
So the next kind of loom we are going to use is called a two-beam loom. So if you can imagine a frame that's standing on the ground, and it's got a bar at the top and a bar at the bottom that rotates, and the wool is wrapped over the top of the bar and round and round and round in a spiral over the top bar, over the bottom bar. And so you can imagine that when you weave, as you can move the bar at the top and the bar at the bottom, and you'll end up weaving a tube of material. And you actually find this in Roman weaving. You find it indicated on, illustrated on Greek vases. It is different from a warp-weighted loom. With a warp-weighted loom, you have a tablet woven border that sits at the top of the loom that's attached on, and you have multiple threads that hang down in pairs, and you have sets of weights that are on the bottom of the threads. And then you have what's called heddle rods, and they are attached to groups of threads which you pull forward to create different what's called sheds, or the gaps in between the threads. So technically, they are very, very different. The two-beam loom is far easier to use. Our twill sits much easier on it. I think there is an assumption that you know, because from the Neolithic to probably about 1100 AD, the warp-weighted loom was assumed to be used for all textiles. Also, you know, we've got a two-beam loom. We have multiple different types of textiles found during the Iron Age, so that suggests we probably have multiple different types of looms as well, each suiting a particular kind of twill. So that's how it's different. I mean, what I found with the warp-weighted loom is to set up a particular 2-1 twill, and what that means is it goes under 2 and over 1, under 2 and over 1, and then on the next row it moves across one, so you end up with a diagonal, or you can get a lozenge twill on that particular kind of loom. It's very, very tricky to set it up. So moving on to it took maybe 6 to 8 weeks to get it right, to get it set up, and this was actually working with an experienced weaver. So it wasn't to do with the fact we didn't know what we were doing. We did, but technically it took that long to set it up. Whereas when we did a small a model of a two-beam loom, which is now actually on the EXARC World Tour, we're able to set it up in a day and a half. So that's not actually saying that's how they did it in the Iron Age, but it seems to be the simplest possible solution. So the next mystery that's going to be solved is, did our textile actually come from this area? Because our 2-1 twill, as I said, it's very, very unusual to see that in Northern Europe in 500 BC. You find it in Roman weaving, you see it 5th century AD in an English piece of linen, and then you don't see it much later on until the 10th century AD, when you start to see it woven into wool. So as I said, we've moved on to the two-beam loom, and we're trying to find out the quickest, easiest way to weave our twill in the best possible fashion, to see how much wool we can make using that loom. Both looms can be used. Both looms have got their strengths and weaknesses. But as I said, the two-beam loom it looks like it's highly likely that it's woven on a particular kind of twill, which is why we're moving over to that now. The only thing we've got in order to create this two-beam loom has actually been a medieval etching. So we've almost had to back engineer that and work out how it's worked. But we have got there now. We've actually got one set up and ready to go. So by the time we get to our interview in August, we'll be able to let you know how that's gone, and then again how the weave compares to making the same kind of twill on a warp-weighted loom.
Thank you so much. Okay, Martha, this is my last question. As for future research, are you planning to recreate the finished shape of the pointed bone? And if so, what tools and techniques are you going to use? Are you also considering the use of these pointed bones by performing experiments and use-wear analysis?
Great, thank you. Yeah, so yes, simple answer is I would love to do future research and actually produce a really good reference collection for all these tools. Slightly more complicated answer is the collection has a great amount of variety morphologically. So we're still waiting. I think Eva David, is currently in the process, I believe, of producing a final typology of the collection based on the work that was done before. So once that's been seen, and hopefully after looking at the collection in more detail, which wasn't possible before, once a better understanding of the range of possible different types of tools that are actually in the collection or different forms, then yes, I would love to create a variety of those. But because that hasn't been achieved yet, I think it'd be really difficult to say what tools and techniques would be appropriate. I definitely think in terms of tools, there may not be much more variety than what I looked at before, just looking at the toolkit that's available in Ireland at the time. Again, similar to the fauna, it's got quite a lot of differences than the rest of Europe at the time. It would be great to do some more experimentation on production and then use-wear analysis, and then eventually also looking at function, because there are questions around function, and possibly some possible evidence of hafting as well. But again, what order this is done in and the opportunities to do any of this work is kind of still remaining. So short answer, yes. More complicated answer is it's so multifaceted, really exciting, but a lot to do.
Yes, I understand that. Okay, that was my last question. Does any of our presenters have questions for each other?
May I ask a question of Margaret?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Margaret, I was really interested in, based on the success or the positive results you got from the wicker hurdles, do you think there may be more uses or scope to use these resources in modern society, given sustainability, given that compared to a lot of other hardwoods that we use in modern society, that these can be coppiced, grown relatively quickly and managed and support local ecosystems and biodiversity?
Well, that is a brilliant question in so many ways. I think, I mean, although I was obviously looking at scaffolding because that's where my interest starts, the actual use of woven materials is just such a massive area, from Neolithic walkways to boats to, I was listening to a talk by one of the excavators on Skara Brae, and he was suggesting that they used stone roofs because there wasn't enough timber in the area. So then I began to think, well, if there wasn't enough timber in the area, was it a woven roof that they used to support that? And when it comes to modern society, yes, I think the whole idea of coppicing and the landscape and using this material in a modern sense would be absolutely brilliant if it can be done. And I can't see why it shouldn't be done. So thank you very much for that question.
Yeah. It reminded me of hedge laying and the intrinsic strength that hedges have and their role in herd management, which we often don't appreciate anymore, and as a food source for locals and encouraging biodiversity and habitat. There's a living example, and then the cut example. I feel like there's an interesting comparison there.
Absolutely, you're right. I mean, the hedges around Devon, where I live in the UK, I mean, the use of those, rather than just, as we do now, sort of just go around chopping them all off as they grow. Yeah, there's so much potential. If we can only put, if you want, a technical number on it so that we know how it performs, which is a bit sort of where obviously the engineering comes in, whereas this conference is more about the archaeology side of things and how it was used in the past. But I think, yes, you're spot on with how it could be used in the future.
Good. Okay, Jason, I do have a question for you. It says, we have a drop-weighted loom at our Neolithic longhouse, which leads to some discussion whether it's too modern for the period. And we didn't get it to work. Would a two-beam loom be more suitable for a Neolithic in southern UK, or realistically no loom at all?
That's a massive question. I think the statement that the loom didn't work, I remember saying that quite a lot of the time. And I remember when we were trying to set up a walk-weighted loom, and half the time I wanted to throw it into the loch, you know. And anyway, that's probably not a very scientific approach, but I can understand that that statement about the loom didn't work. I think in order to answer that question, and I can probably do that and maybe on Discord afterwards, is to try and find out what kind of twill were you trying to weave? How was the loom set up? When people are using the warp-weighted loom, there is an assumption about the way people used it in the past. And for anyone who doesn't know what a warp-weighted loom is, you've got threads hanging down, you've got the weights on the bottom, and you have pairs of threads. So you've got one at the back of the loom, and one hangs over the bar at the front of the loom. And people try to work out these ancient twills and think it's not going to work. And the problem really lies in the fact that there's been an assumption made of these two sets of weights, one at the front, one at the back. And that's not actually come from archaeological evidence. It's actually come from someone who was researching a PhD thesis in 1956. And they found a photograph of some Norwegian weavers who were standing at a loom, and they were weaving a blanket, and they got these three sets of weights. And so an assumption was made after that, this is how they were set up. But of course, there's no evidence to support that whatsoever. It's just based on this particular video. In order to make any, I mean, I have found to make the warp-weighted loom work, you need a single line of weights. If you don't split them in half, you don't have 2 or 3 rows of weights, if the weights are all in a line, you can pretty much get any twill that you like. So it would be interesting to know why the loom didn't work, or why it was assumed it didn't work. For the Neolithic, I think there is an assumption that the wall-weighted loom was the one that was used. The two-beam loom is normally associated with the Eastern Mediterranean. The two-beam loom is very, very easy to set up. It's extremely simple to set up, but as I said, this really goes back to what kind of twill, what kind of weave. Is it a tabby weave? Is it a 2-1, a diamond twill? It all depends on the weave you're trying to make. But as I said, I can answer that more fully in the Discord chat, and maybe that could open up a debate, and we could kind of open up a dialogue about exactly why it didn't work, and maybe I could help in maybe providing thoughts on how it might work in the future, or a different kind of loom setup, or a different kind of weighted loom setup. So I'd like to open up that debate and help out if I can.
Thank you so much. Okay, do we have any other questions?
I have a question for Aidan, if I might. I was wondering, you had built a roundhouse that got burnt down, my understanding is.
Yeah.
And you're rebuilding it?
Yes.
I was just wondering, with either or of them, what you were doing, whether you had a ring beam to sort of support the walls a bit, and what weave you were using with that.
Oh, they're two great questions. Okay, so we had a we had a house which was burnt down by little 15-year-old Scots in May 2019. The CMAC was broken into, and they set it alight. So what we actually did was we did an excavation on it there about 2 weeks ago, and now we're building a slightly larger one. These are post and wattle buildings, up to 6-7 meters across in diameter, and there is no element in that post and wattle building which is thicker than your wrist. So there are no internal roof supports. There's no evidence for big post holes, anything like that. The door frames are built of oak jambs, but everything else is essentially hazel rods and so one of our questions in our experimental archaeology project, and there's a pile of videos on our YouTube channel which show it, was how did these buildings work? Like the largest building that we have, which is built of post and wattle like that, is 11.2 meters across in diameter, and again with no evidence for any internal roof supports. So what we looked at was we looked at some of the ethnographic evidence. So, you know, the Sarakatsani goat herders in northern Greece, they build these simple structures, roundhouses built of branches. The Wichita people in Kansas, there are photographs in the early 20th century of these massive houses, which are again built of branch material, and we have medieval references in Ireland to, you know, the Irish building houses of branches and bracken. So what we decided was that what we were probably looking at was a joint inverted basket,
Right.
which there is which is called in architecture a non-differentiated structure. There's no wall, there's no roof. It's all wall and it's all roof. So what you get is a domical basket, which is essentially an inverted domical basket. It's not conical, it's domical. And a dome has basically huge strength in every meridian, horizontally, diagonally, and vertically. So despite the fact of the elements being really light, like no thicker than your wrist, as I said, it held up a 1.5 tons of header. It would have stood for longer if it hadn't been burnt down. And as you've identified yourself in the question, the key thing is the weave. It's not simple in-out wattle that we're all familiar with. It's a type of braid. I need to show you the images of it. Essentially what happens is that once the verticals are up, and even the verticals are complicated. It's that there's no single vertical. It's continually inserting new verticals into the interstices between wattles. So as you go up, you're essentially like building a basket. And then the horizontal rods are behind one post. They come out, they go in front of two. Then the next one is behind one, goes out in front of two. And all the way around, and then you go back to the start and you take that first one and put it behind one and in front of two. So essentially what happens is that all of the rods are kind of braiding around each other like a rope. So instead of in-out wattle, you get this essentially braided weave, which consumes a fair amount of wattle, but is immensely strong. So not only are you making a strong basket, you're making an extra strong basket. And looking at that now, we were, our own experiences, you could probably build it in about 2 weeks if you had all the materials to hand. And the final point I would make is there, amongst the Sarakatsani goat herders in the late 19th, early 20th century in Greece, these roundhouses were made by the women of the village, of these nomadic peoples, for the cheesemaker. And the cheesemaker would come and he'd make cheeses in this specially built house. And they would just use branches and build it exactly the same as way I've described. So one of the things we say to people is, yeah, house building, it doesn't have to be a man's work. You got a house there, it looks like a basket. Who mostly makes baskets? So we found that also to be kind of a nice little bit of challenging of gender stereotypes. There's no heavy physical work involved. It's just patience and weaving. So as I've said before, experimental archaeology enables you to be provocative about all of the assumptions that we carry around in our heads about the past. Thank you.
Fascinating. Yes, I'd love to speak to you some more on that, and obviously see what you've actually done. I have had a look at your pictures on Facebook. Yeah. But it obviously isn't quite the right resolution to pick up any detail.
Okay. Sure, get in touch with me. I'd be happy to share with you all the information that we have. And
yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
And please God, that maybe you might be able to come and visit yourself someday and see it.
Yeah, that would be even better. Oh, there's one other point in your talk. You were talking about the alder being called redwood.
The red man.
Red. Okay. Yeah. One of the things that I found fascinating when I was stripping some willow, the sap was already rising, and I came back the next day, and it looked more like rhubarb. It was an amazing colour.
Yeah.
And it was just that whole way that wood can have that colour as well. It lasted for about a week before it sort of dissipated. But yes. So I was fascinated to hear that those images that were made of a wood that changes colour.
Yeah, and it's the colour of blood. The red colour is very it's very striking. Alder, there's something in the chemicals and under the bark that produces this red colour, which fades to a brown afterwards. But I seem to remember, I think it's even red on your hands. And I don't think it's any accident that these figures are mostly made of alder, because of like that thing I said before about objects and people not being distinct from each other. You've got a wood which bleeds. So do we, and the boundaries are literally fluid.
Yeah.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you as well.
Again, I want to thank everybody for their wonderful presentations and wonderful questions from our audience, and have a good night.